Alright everybody, in this video I'm going to start the watercolor process on this 2-point perspective board game. As I work, I'm going to try to give you guys some useful tips along the way. The first thing you got to know about watercolors is that you need water to make it work. Water is the vehicle that drives the color across the paper. If you don't have enough water, it's really hard to spread that color around. Another thing to note when you're mixing colors is that you probably don't need to add as much color to the water as you think you do. You can change the color of the water that you're using, the watercolor, by just adding a little bit of that pigment from the tray. Along with that, the way you change the value of a color is through the ratio of water to color as well. So the more water you have versus how much color you have, that's gonna, if you have a lot of water, it's gonna make the color lighter. If you have just a little bit of water and a lot of color, then it's gonna make the color appear darker. The nice thing about watercolors is that it can be done in layers. So if you're not feeling super confident about doing the watercolors, maybe try to start off a little bit lighter with your colors, and you can always go back after it's dry and add another layer to darken up areas. And that's a great way to add details. It's a great way to kind of shade with watercolors, is you can do it in layers. You can do a light layer, then you do another layer that darkens up some of the areas, and so on, to build up details and value. What you see me doing right now, which I'm finishing up, was a wet and wet technique. So the paper was wet in that area, right in the center of the artwork. And then I dropped in some wet color, and that spreads that color around, gives it a very faded look. It kind of bleeds through the water, and it only goes into the areas where the paper is wet. If you don't want the color to spread into a certain area, then you just have to make sure that that area is dry, and the color and the water won't want to go there. As I'm working around these shapes, there's lots of little shapes that I'm trying to fill in with the watercolor. The way I'm trying to do that and to control the paint and the water is to carefully use the tip of the brush. I'm not laying the brush down on its side, and I'm not really pressing the brush down hard so it spreads out the bristles. I'm using the tip kind of like I would use a pencil and trying to work around the edges of shapes. I want you to remember that if you make a mistake, if you accidentally get color in a place where you don't want it, or if you put too much color in an area or too much water in an area, you can use the sponge technique. I don't know if that's actually what it's called, but you just clean off your brush in the water, you dry it off really well, and then you can soak up any excess water from your paper, just like I am doing right now. Or if you put a color in an area that you don't want it to go, you clean off your brush, you wet your brush with clean water, and then you can kind of gently scrub at the area that you want to pull the color out of. And then once again, you go clean off your brush, rinse it, you dry it, and then you use that dry brush to sponge up the scrubbed up color that you had just scrubbed up with your brush. So it's the sponge technique is what I'm calling it. And that's your eraser basically to try to fix mistakes. You'll see me using that technique to fix my own mistakes several times throughout the process of this video. If you want a color to be really smooth in a shape and not have a lot of lines or marks, you need to use enough water. Keep the paper fairly wet while you're working in a certain area, and you can basically drag that wetness and that color around to different areas of the shape that you're working in. It's best if you can go from one side of the shape to the other side of the shape, to make it smooth, but you don't always have to do that. And watch, you can see me using the sponge technique to clean up a little mistake right there. And I think I'm going to do it over on the other side. Yep, I am. Just kind of scrub away that little mistake with some clean water. And then dry brush, I'm going to soak it right on up. Might take me a couple of tries to do it. So that's how you clean up your mistakes. If you make little mistakes along edges or too much color in an area, too much water in an area, that's how you do it. When I was doing that moon crater space a minute ago, I want you to notice that I left some of the areas white, and I'm going to do it in this robot as well. So any areas that you want to have be white, you need to leave it white. Don't paint it. The white of the paper is pretty much your white in this type of artwork in watercolors. Okay, I'm about to attempt another wet in wet technique with this hole in the middle of my board game, and I slowed the video down because I really want you to actually see it. I wet the paper first with just clean water, and now I'm dropping in some wet color. And I can actually pick up my paper a little bit and let that wetness kind of spread around in different ways on its own. It'll kind of do what it wants a little bit. And when I do that, I can get a really kind of blended, hazy effect to it. So sometimes that's really desirable to do that. Like a lot of art mediums, there's a lot of layering that goes on with watercolors. So you can see in the robot and in the moon craters, I layer more color and more details into areas to build up the values. So building up the dark spots, and building up the little textures and the little details. So lots of layering. Okay, as the rest of the video plays along, I'm going to recap some of the things that I've already said in this video, some of the tips I've given you. And I'm going to recap them because I really want you to remember them and just be able to identify them and go back to them when you need them, okay? So here's some of the things that I've talked about in this video so far. You need water. Watercolor needs water. It's the vehicle that drives the color across the paper. You probably can use less color in the water than you think. You can always go back and make it darker. Using the tip, just kind of like you would with a pencil, the tip of the brush is what you want to use to work around the edges of shapes. You can use the sponge technique to clean up your mistakes. So if you accidentally put too much color, too much water, or put color in an area that you didn't want it, then you can sponge it up. You might have to scrub it first with clean water, but then you can sponge it up and get rid of those mistakes for the most part. Layering is a great technique. So you start off with lighter colors, and then as time goes along, you can layer darker colors to achieve greater details and textures and value differences. You can use the wet in wet technique to create kind of fuzzy blends of color. So if you start off with wet paper, you kind of paint the water into a shape, then you can drop wet color into it and it can spread throughout that shape in sort of random but really cool ways. You can add texture by creating different marks with the paint is another technique. And if you want areas to be white, because there often is white highlights in things, or at least there appears to be, then you need to leave those areas just the plain whiteness of the paper. That's how you achieve white with watercolors. So I'm not going to be finishing this artwork in this video right now. I'm going to have to make another video to finish it up. And I'm pretty happy with my progress so far, but what I want you to know is that I'm not done. I can still achieve quite a lot of development with my different subjects throughout this artwork. I can layer in other details and change the values of things slightly. And remember, there's a whole other step after the watercolor, which is to use the ink pens again, the illustration pens, to get even more detail and to, shade some really dark detail spots. So that's where we're headed. As always, good luck and have fun. Enjoy the rest of the video, you guys. Happy arting! Plant monster!